My name is Christian Liddy, I think some of you already know. Welcome to the third of four events, a series of public talks, discussions, conversations on, about and sort of around the Charter of the Forest. Really, the purpose of the series is to use the anniversary of the Charter not only to think about its meaning in its immediate historical context, and that's exactly what we did a couple of weeks ago with Dr. David Crook, but to also think more broadly about the many meanings of the Charter and the many meanings that the Charter might have and hold for us today, whether it's in terms of debates about the environment, debates about privatisation of land, rights of citizenship, and so forth. And as with last week's event, what we're going to do is hear from two speakers, Professor Guy Standing, who I'll introduce in a moment, and Dr. Cherry Leonardi from the History Department. And each speaker has been tasked, charged with the responsibility of speaking for about 20 to 25 minutes, max 25 minutes. We'll hear from Guy first and then from Cherry, and then we'll open it up hopefully for discussion and questions afterwards. And tonight's broad theme is common rights and natural resources. So, without further ado, our first speaker is Guy Standing, co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network, I think over 30 years ago, I think that's right. He's the author of many recent books, such titles as the Precariat, the sequel, Precariat Charter, both of which actually proved to be extraordinarily prescient in tracing the emergence of a new social class, disenfranchised, disillusioned, economically insecure and socially kind of bereft, really, and we've seen perhaps some of the consequences of that over the past year or so. He's also the author of a very recent book, it appeared this year, Basic Income and How We Can Make It Happen. Guy visited Durham a couple of years ago to see the Durham Magna Carta and the Changing Face of Revolt exhibition in which I was involved. I'm delighted to welcome Guy back tonight to talk on the subject of celebrating the Charter by reviving the Commons. Guy.
Thank you very much. I brought my watch. It's truly an honour to be speaking about the anniversary of the Charter of the Forest. You all know that there's one of the originals here, and the other one is in Lincoln Castle. I think it's a momentous event that has been conspicuously ignored in Britain. It's sad. And I want to talk from a particular perspective because 31 years ago we formed an international network to promote basic income. That means everybody having a right to a modest basic income as an economic right. And over the years we've grown to the point where we have formal networks in 35 countries, thousands of members. And a game we sometimes play is who originated the idea of everybody having a basic income. And some people say Thomas More with Utopia, some GDH Cole or somebody else. But I want to nominate William Marshall. William Marshall, as you all know, was the regent of England, Anjou and Aquitaine. And he was one of the two people who put their seals to these documents on November the 6th, 1217. Imagine the scene. There was a 10-year-old king, Henry III, probably bewildered with what was going on. These parchments were there. He couldn't put his own seal because he wasn't allowed to at that age. And there, these two gentlemen. Now, I think the cardinal, who also put his seal, was probably less knowledgeable about the context And the context is very important because I don't think another context would have led to the Charter of the Forest. England had just been invaded. Turned out it was the last invasion that took place. And they'd been defeated, the French, at the Battle of Lincoln in May 1217. And of course, there were a lot of widows in the country at that time. And it's very interesting that the demographic group that gets mentioned in these documents were widows. Very important point. Now, imagine the scenes, these two charters. Magna Carta only became the Magna Carta that day. So we should be celebrating the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta as well. And actually, the Charter of the Forest was called the Magna Carta de Foresta. So it was a Magna Carta. But it's much shorter, it's 17 articles. The original Charter of Liberties that everyone knows about from school days was sealed June 15th, 1215 in Runnymede. And that had 63 articles, but the day of November the 6th, 1217, it was reduced to 47 articles. And part of them had been taken out and formed part of the Charter of the Forest. Now, the interesting thing was that the Magna Carta, you can see, this is a little bit of historical license I'm using, but you can see it was essentially about the rights of property owners, the rights of the barons, the freedmen, civil rights as well. It was primarily about those rights. Very important document founding our Constitution. But in some ways, the Charter of the Forest, in my view, was more important. Because it was the first charter in history that was a charter for the propertyless, the common man and women of this country. And you can see that the charter, I'll come to the contents in a moment, but it was about the rights of the commoners in the commons. And in 2015, beg your pardon, when Christian invited me here to give a talk, I was really privileged because he put on, I'm sure many of you saw it, the best exhibition of the celebration of the Magna Carta in the country. I got asked to speak in Salisbury, I got invited to speak at various other places, and I promise you, they didn't compare. Because Christian managed to capture the historical evolution and the subversive character of both of these charters. I remember we went on a tour, if he remembers, and we just stood in awe of the originals. And I stood in awe with all of them. And when we decided to try and celebrate the Charter of the Forest this year, I met up with groups in and around London, the Occupy movement. And we were having a celebration because they had asked me to go and speak in Runnymede in June 2015 in the woods above Runnymede to celebrate. But there was an eco-village, an Occupy movement in the woods. And we celebrated and talked about the subversive characters of the two charters. And earlier this year we met up, and I was rabbiting on about how important and how much more important the Charter of the Forest was. And we formed a group to celebrate. And the first event we did, we rented a barge on the Thames. And we went symbolically from Windsor to Runnymede with workshops on the barge about all the significance today of the Charter of the Forest. Had some very very subversive characters. You wouldn't want to meet us. But it was really a beautiful day. Then yesterday we had a similar event in Sherwood Forest. You may have heard of Sherwood Forest and the associations with the rebellious nature of the times. Today I am infinitely honoured to be here because this is the anniversary day. And I've been saying to friends and everybody I meet in Canada recently, in Portugal, I said, I want you all to lift a glass on November the 6th and toast, because this is the most subversive constitutional document in history. I was telling Christian, I was invited to speak to the Green Party annual conference in Harrogate. I'm not a member of any party, but you can probably guess my politics. But I was invited and I played a game. I went through the various things, saying, this was the first environmental charter in history. Went on and on. I could see this huge audience, and they were all going, what's he talking about? What's he talking about? What was it? What document? What document? I could see people asking. And then when I got to the point, it was the Charter of the Forest. I saw people writing down. They were saying, I must go and read it. I'm sure Wikipedia the next day was hot with their use. Now, the incredible thing about the Charter of the Forest is that it has the distinction of being longer on the British statute books than any other piece of legislation in history. 754 years. And during the celebrations of Magna Carta in 2015, the Minister of Justice, Lord Foulkes, was asked in a written question in the House of Lords, are you going to have equivalent celebrations for the 800th anniversary of the Charter of the Forest? He wrote back, you can look at the answer, he wrote back saying, no, we're not. It's unimportant and it has no international implications. It's not important elsewhere. So earlier this year, when we were planning our round of events, I wrote to Noam Chomsky and I said, dear Noam, would you please send us a 2-liner tribute to the Charter of the Forest? He wrote back, Guy, okay. And typically, he wrote half a page, if not more. Then I thought I'd write to the American Bar Association. And the American Bar Association have a lot of enthusiasm, and they wrote back and said, it's extremely important. I didn't tell them about Lord Foulkes. Extremely important, it helped found the US Constitution, the American Constitution. It was a founding document that influenced. I felt like shoving their answer in the face of Mr. Lord Foulkes, the noble lord. Now, it's a first environmental charter because it advocates the protection of nature, but it also contains, embedded in the text, and it's very difficult to read, as you all know, because it's got many concepts and words that have faded from the English language. It was written in ancient Norman, medieval Norman, but even in the translated version, it's got words that we don't use today. But it was the first environmental charter in another sense. It established principles of the stewardship of the commons. If Gerard Hardin, who wrote an infamous, I think, rather than famous article in 1968 called The Tragedy of the Commons, and the neoliberals on the right have used it to say, see, if you have a commons, it will be overused and all the resources will disappear, and therefore we've got to have privatization and private property. In actual fact, if you read the Charter and you see the debates that took place afterwards, it was about preserving the commons, the stewardship, how to keep it for perpetuity. It was also the first charter, as I said earlier, for the propertyless, and it was an remarkable thing that it forced the monarchy to return land. Think of how radical that was in 1217. Because William the Conqueror and his bandits had taken 25 royal forests. By the time the other kings had taken a whole lot more, there were 143 in 1217. And this charter, although it didn't take place automatically and fully, but it established that all of that land had to be returned to the commons. Remarkable. I'm convinced that if there had not been a 10-year-old king who didn't know what the hell he was allowing to happen, we would never have seen that subversive outcome. But of course, they just fought a civil war. The commoners had lost a lot of people. The widows needed to be compensated in some way. And I think that context, Christian could probably correct me, but I think that context helped make it what it was. But the key point for me and my narrative and the interest I've got, and I've got some copies of the book if you're interested, is that this was the first charter in history to assert that every free man and woman had a right to subsistence. A right to subsistence in the commons. And the words, the specifics in the charter are very clear about that. Very specific. The right to pannage, be able to feed the pigs in the autumn. The right to herbage, the right to having access to herbal medicines. The right to piscary, the right to be able to fish and take fish from the water. The right to turbery, which is access to peat for fuel. Key point, the right to estivars. A lovely thing that was put in the Magna Carta, but it could have been put in the Charter of the Forest. The right to every widow to have the right to estivars, meaning the right to necessities for life, and also the right to refuse to be remarried. Quite a profound advance for feminism that day. Fantastic advance, because women were treated as equals up to that point. Lord Fox, I want to tell you, that is important. Now, the right to marl, which is a beautiful thing. There's a lovely Article 12 of the Charter of the Forest. The right to marl, very, very important. What it meant was that people had the right to take clay and things from under the ground, minerals, soil, from the soil, to use to make utensils, to make their housing, for their livelihoods. Clay was vital. Make a clay pit where you could keep things, water, fish, whatever. And also you can read into the Charter another wonderful principle, which is far more radical than the Communist Manifesto or the Soviet Constitution or any of the other leftist documents you could name. The right to work. The right to have access to raw materials in the commons to use to make your livelihood. Profound. You had the right to do that. Not only do you have the right to subsistence, but you had the right to the means of production, to use the Marxian term, and the right to have access to raw materials for production. That's quite radical. You will not find a more radical statement than that. It's also, in a sense, that day, I think, the first feminist charter for the reasons I've just said. And what that charter did was make a huge advance for what we call Republican freedom. Not only limiting the Crown's ability to exact horrible punishments, like castration for killing a deer, rolling that back, at that time, was a huge advance. Any other time too, for that matter. But it was, that day, an advance for Republican freedom because it restricted the rights of property owners. Quite significant. Now the Charter needs to be resurrected today. The principles underlying it are more important today than ever. That was what the American Bar Association, those words they sent to me. But we've suffered 5 waves of enclosure. This, don't forget, was rolling back enclosure in a major way. First, of course, those early kings had enclosed large parts of our country, and there's a certain irony that the richest man in this country today is the Duke of Westminster, who is one of them, quibble about it. But the late Duke of Westminster, who died recently, he was asked by a young entrepreneurial type, what advice would you give to young entrepreneurs? And the Duke, no doubt in his dotage, had the unwisdom of saying, be a descendant of a friend of William the Conqueror. And most of the land that is owned by the wealthy today is descended from various phases of enclosure. The first one was the one we've been talking about. The second, of course, was the Tudors, particularly Henry VIII, who, when he sacked the monasteries, distributed 10 million acres of land, much of which had been part of the ecclesiastical ownership or the commons, to his favourites. They didn't show a day of hard work to get it, other than probably killing a few people or whatever. But 10 million acres, that's the second. Then Cromwell came along, and having taken from the king, he distributed a whole lot of land to his followers. Different types, but, you know. And then, of course, we get the 19th century with an extraordinary thing that between 1760 and 1870, there were 5,000 enclosure acts passed by Parliament. 5,000. Most important one was in 1845, but the 5,000 put together transferred over 7 million acres, more acres, to a handful of dukes and their lesser brethren, mere lords and ladies. So today we have the most concentrated land ownership of any country that I know. Horrendous concentration. There's going to be, but don't tell them, there's going to be an Occupy movement of some of my unworthy friends tomorrow and the next day of some of the land of the Duke of Buccleuch, who has a mere 277,000 acres inherited in these various ways. He's been a lackey, no doubt he's done a lot of lackeying, but he has the biggest landholding in the country. They will be trespassing, so you don't know about it, and you don't approve of it, etc., but I do. Now, I want to end by saying this. We today are experiencing the 5th wave of enclosures. I called it in the book, I've written a book called The Corruption of Capitalism, and I called it in the book The Plunder of the Commons. In a sense, it's worse than some of the previous, because it's plundering not just the land, it's doing that. It's plundering urban land. We've seen the growth of things like POPs, privately owned public spaces. Large parts of London have been surreptitiously sold off to oligarchs, often kleptocratic oligarchs, people from foreign lands who have no interest in preserving the commons and our facilities. Not only do we have POPs, but I have a new one, which is CORPS, commercially operated rural public spaces. You may have read George Monbiot's lambast about the Lake District. I think he could have been even stronger. Because what has happened is you take an iconic place like the Lake District, which is meant to be part of our commons, and not only have you been commercialising part of it, but the large-scale commercial sheep farmers have effectively taken it over, and they are clearing the land of all other biodiversity and mobility of species to survive in the Lake District, converting a rich piece of nature, which allowed a whole lot of commoners to survive, to the domain of commercial sheep farmers with subsidies from the government. That's not a commons. And that is happening in a lot of other places. I've been asked by John MacDonald to help draw up a charter of the commons. Everybody in this room is welcome to suggest specific items for that charter. We are seeing a terrible loss that the William Marshall, hardly a radical I dare say, would be furious. He couldn't understand. Why have we privatized water to the point where it's owned by 9 monopolistic corporations? Thames Water is owned entirely by a foreign group of profiteers. They distributed to themselves £1.6 billion in dividends in the last few years, and then they were convicted earlier this year of pouring 1.4 million tons of untreated sewage into the Thames. And they were also convicted of not doing anything to fix the leaks. So a lot of extra sewage and things is constantly spilling. They got a slap on the wrists, fined £20 million. Guilty. But when you've got 1.6 billion, what's 20 million? It's pocket money. We need to rescue our water commons. And there are other parts of the commons that we need to rescue, including we need a bunch of radicals like I've been mixing with, and in this respect I hope many of you in this room are similarly minded. The government set up a natural capital committee. Think about what that means. A natural capital committee to find ways of turning all the commons into profitable assets. The commons in the Charter of the Forest were for reproduction. They were for living. They were about a way of living. They're about the rights of you and me to live. A natural capital committee. I have ancient Anglo-Saxon words that would apply to those members. I lambasted a little, I'm not doing so now of course, I'm lambasted a bit in the book. But we are facing today a real crisis of our commons. And all of us should stand up and remember that the Charter of the Forest established an ethos and a subversive, beautiful way of living. The commoners, subsistence, reproduction, stewardship, forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich. Just have to wait a moment to while this warms up, I'm afraid. Whilst we just wait a moment or two, I'd like to well, to thank Guy for a very provocative paper that I'm sure will raise lots of questions that we can address shortly. But I'd like to now move on to our second speaker, who is my colleague, Dr. Cherry Leonardi, who is far too modest to say this, but she really is one of the UK's leading African historians. She specialises in the history of Uganda and South Sudan. She's the author of a 2013 book dealing with government in South Sudan, which looked at the role of the state and its relationship to traditions of colonial governance and customary justice. And she's got a current project on contested borderlands, looking at issues of land governance, land disputes. And tonight she's going to speak on the Charter of the Forest in a kind of very broad African context.
That could be a problem. Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much to Christian for involving me in this series. It's been absolutely fascinating being part of these discussions. I was sorry I missed last week's, but to look at the Charter and its implications for very different periods and places. I'm hoping to show you enough pictures that you can imagine yourselves in hot, sunny places on this cold evening, and to try to think about the implications in these quite different contexts. And if I have a very basic point to make, it is that in the context where I work, common rights are complicated. And I hope to convey some of that complexity to you without losing you too much in the detail of this. The two countries where I've been working, as Christian said, are these neighbouring countries of South Sudan, which became independent in 2011, and Uganda. And I'm particularly talking about the area in the northwest of Uganda and the border with South Sudan here, what's called Central Equatoria. And I just want to start with a bit of very basic context before I come on to the main points that I want to make. This is what it looks like in this border area. And really discussing these ideas about common rights, rights to subsistence, is highly relevant here because most land is used for subsistence farming, for grazing, and the land is held under what are commonly called customary or communal forms of tenure. And in these systems, individuals' rights to land are dependent on their membership of communities that are often called clans, and which are defined through their father's line or their husband's line. Or individuals might get land by negotiating with the leaders of these clans. Land authorities, this is usually an older man, who claims descent from the founding father of the clan, has an important spiritual relationship with the land, and hence plays a role in allocating and governing land for the clan members, together with other elders. But he would not normally interfere with individual family lands, many of which have been occupied for generations. Very few people have formal titles to their land, though the process of privatisation and registration, as Guy mentioned, is spreading and accelerating, particularly in the urban areas. And land rights have really become very contentious in this region, as in many other parts of Africa. Accusations of land grabbing are widespread, whether directed at governments, wealthy or powerful individuals, or international or national companies. And so there are heated debates among academics and policymakers, drawing on those old debates about the tragedy of the commons, over whether privatisation is a good thing, whether it threatens or gives more security to the land rights of the poor and vulnerable, particularly women, whether customary systems are patriarchal, discriminatory to women, and a hindrance to development, or whether these are actually the best means of safeguarding access to land for the majority of ordinary people. So I think there are three related areas where the Forest Charter, Charter of the Forest, may be relevant to these debates, and that's really what I want to expand on in this talk. The first of these, if I understand correctly, the Charter did not establish common rights. which had existed in localised, probably quite unremarked ways, long before 1217. But it was the first time that such rights had been formally recognised in anything like a legal charter, a royal charter. In South Sudan and Uganda, customary rights were recognised to a limited extent by colonial governments, largely disregarded by independent governments, and then have been strikingly given national constitutional recognition since the 1990s. So I want to ask what the effects of that state recognition might be. Secondly, while the Charter's recognition of common rights was clearly very significant, many of its provisions actually applied only to free men, so the elite of knights, barons, bishops, earls, and landowning peasants, not the serfs who made up the majority of the population. And in some ways it was about trying to assert and protect these private land rights of such men against the crown. And I think there may be a parallel here with the debates over land in African contexts. In terms of the role of local elites, not in this context private landowners, but the customary land authorities. How far do they pursue individual benefits rather than the common good, particularly as land is becoming seen as more valuable? And thirdly, I think perhaps the most relevant aspect of the Charter to the African context is its recognition that land rights could be plural, multiple, and layered. So the Crown had rights over the whole forest, but within the forest, both private and common rights could also be recognised and exercised. And there are real similarities here with the Ugandan and South Sudanese contexts. It's not that all land is held and used communally. There are also these long-standing individual rights, and there are different kinds of communal rights, such as temporary or seasonal grazing or hunting rights. And these layers of rights or multiple claims to land make it very complicated to privatise land, but they also complicate in a way the idea of common rights. So this leads me into my first question about the effects of the state recognising communal rights. Because I would argue that the recognition of communal rights by colonial governments in this region was a way for them to actually ignore or to subordinate individual rights to land. Both Sudan and Uganda came under British control from the 1890s. In some of their central areas, the governments promoted registration of individual land titles. But in other regions, including those that I'm talking about in northern Uganda and southern Sudan, the colonial governments assumed that land was held communally by tribes or smaller communities, and they did not attempt to register land titles. Customary rights were recognised as rights of usage rather than full ownership, and the land title was vested ultimately in the government. So the state retained the right to appropriate unregistered land for its own benefits, or its own purposes. And that included for towns like the government headquarters and town that was established at Juba, which is nowadays the capital of South Sudan. But also for forests and game reserves, from which people were evicted and where they were forbidden to hunt. Sometimes local protests against these reserves led to the payment of compensation to communities. But for example, the local communities that were moved away from this site to make way for the creation of Juba, their descendants nowadays still complain that they were never given compensation for that land. They were moved further down the river. But this kind of appropriation of land was relatively limited in these areas in the colonial period, and it's really in the post-colonial period that the implications of colonial policy become more obvious and more contentious. Sudan became independent in 1956 and Uganda a few years later in 1962. And both countries would soon come under the rule of military governments that were authoritarian, centralising, eager to push for development, and which went much further than the colonial governments had in asserting state ownership of land. In Sudan in particular, this led by the 1970s to programmes of large-scale mechanised agriculture, which involved substantial appropriation of land in some areas. And then, the discovery of oil in southern Sudan led to fears that land would be appropriated there, and indeed by the 1990s local populations were being forced out of the oil fields. The resulting grievances are seen to have been crucial in galvanising opposition to the government by the 1980s, and the main rebel movement championed the slogan that land belongs to the people. That would feed through into the enshrining of customary law and communal land rights in South Sudan's constitution following peace in 2005. And interestingly, there was a sort of parallel movement in Uganda. The government there had similarly recognised customary land tenure alongside freehold and leasehold tenures in the 1995 National Constitution. So this sounds wonderful, but the Ugandan government has also been explicit that public policy regards freehold as the property regime of the future. And the government continually stresses the value of land for national development, with an overall goal of, I quote, optimal use and management of land resources for a prosperous and industrialised economy. And to add to this, oil has now also been discovered in northern Uganda, and so the role of the state in managing natural resources and rights over minerals is being reasserted. This is from a couple of years ago, the President Museveni emphasising that the state was responsible for minerals, had the rights to minerals, and you can just tell those villagers to get out. You cannot stop the state from accessing its assets. So such statements only fuel the widespread perception in northern Uganda that the government and powerful individuals will grab more land, and that land itself is potentially valuable. Similarly, in South Sudan, the government has appeared to promote customary land rights in its legislation, while being accused of ignoring those rights in numerous contexts of land grabbing by powerful interests, particularly in the military. And this is feeding into the ongoing conflict in South Sudan. So while common rights have greater legal recognition, many ordinary people feel more worried than ever about their individual or family rights to land. And there are questions in this context also about the effects of state recognition in giving new opportunities to those who can successfully claim authority over communal land. And this brings me on to the second point about the extent to which communal rights can be safeguarded by local or intermediary elites. One of the reasons for colonial governments to emphasise communal land tenure was in order to strengthen the authority of the chiefs and headmen that they had appointed to govern local communities, like this man on the right there. These were men identified by the governments as useful leaders, sometimes because they had some prior authority as local strongmen, religious authorities, but more often because they were interpreters, good negotiators, or agents for the government. And so they were usually quite separate from the clan land authorities, who were largely ignored by the governments, and who would of course say that the chiefs had no right to allocate or govern land. But the colonial governments tried to build up the power of chiefs. For example, they introduced local laws that gave chiefs a right to the share of any animal that was killed by hunters on chiefs' territory. And that was the kind of traditional right that was due to the clan land owners. So some scholars of African history have argued that colonial chiefs amassed unprecedented power through their control over land and labour. I would argue this was more limited in southern Sudan and northern Uganda, not least by the spiritual power and sanctions of the clan leaders, who were seen to hold power over the health, fertility and security of the land and its people. The role of chiefs as intermediaries with government has endured. I don't have time to go into the reasons for it, but they're commonly referred to nowadays as customary authorities. But the role of these clan land authorities has also continued at the most local level, and is increasingly harnessed now by local politicians and others in land and boundary disputes. Since the 1990s, the recognition of customary land tenure has led to the establishment of new hybrid forms of local land governance. Land committees made up of local government officials together with certain chiefs or clan leaders. Sometimes individual chiefs or clan leaders have sold or leased land, largely to their own profit, and particularly in the expanding urban areas. There's often bitter competition between these leaders and between chiefs and clan heads. The clan leaders are nowadays, like this man, they're rather confusingly referred to in English as landlords, which means quite literally lords of the land, you know, like a chief or a priest, but not rentiers. But this is from an interview that I did with one of the clan landlords, who was trying to emphasise that if people needed land in the past, they would come to the landlord and they would give him some kind of traditional gift of food or drink. But that wasn't selling the land, it was a way of forging relations with the clan. But such gifts have increasingly now been transformed into monetary transactions. And all of this has created considerable rivalry and resentment, as well as growing feelings of insecurity among poorer, weaker, more vulnerable people. And as the real or perceived benefits to be gained from control of land have increased, so more disputes and conflicts have emerged over the boundaries between local government units, between different chiefs, and these often develop into tensions and conflicts along ethnic or clan lines. So we're seeing really increasingly exclusive and exclusionary definitions of communal rights. And these, of course, challenge the long history of multiple layered rights in land, which I want to come to finally. Historic land governance was based in a sense on the right to subsistence, on the use value and the spiritual and moral value of land, rather than on property regimes or the exchange value of land. In telling histories of land arrangements, people in these areas often emphasise that people were more valuable than land. People were the means of production, protection, status and strength, and there was plenty of land. So land was, if anything, primarily a means of forging and maintaining social relations, bringing new people into the clan, as this man was emphasising. You know, newcomers who were given land gradually became part of the clan, even if they were not related to begin with. And land rights have continued to be embedded in social and kinship relations. When women get married, they join the family and clan of their husband, and they're expected to access land there. But the right of women to access land for subsistence, to provide food for them and their children, is fundamentally recognised in these customary systems. And it was also relatively common for them to be given land for whatever reason by their father or brothers in their own home area. Then, in addition to farmland and settlements, there were lands used for grazing cattle and other livestock, for hunting and fishing and so on, where the often long-standing right of other clans, other communities, to use the land has long been recognised, provided that they in turn recognised the authority of the clan whose land they were coming into, by giving them a portion of the animals they hunted, as I mentioned, or some other token of appreciation, as it's often referred to now. Hose given in exchange for bringing cattle to water. I don't want to over-idealise this image of past land systems where everyone could access land and other resources and it was all harmonious. Of course, there have always been disputes and conflicts, people driven out of particular areas. But it was perhaps easier to avoid or resolve these because there was generally more land than people, migration to new areas was a solution, and because land rights were understood in terms of rights of use rather than in terms of ownership. And so the same piece of land could be used by many different people for different purposes. Now, though, these customary principles and ideals of land governance are under increasing pressure from several factors. Population increase, change in settlement patterns, people want to live close to roads, close to services and towns. You probably can't see very clearly this aerial image, but every piece of land there is divided into farms in a much more intense way than it would have been at one time. New perceptions of the commercial value of land and the beginning of sale or leasing of customary land. So in this context, clan authorities and family heads are interpreting land rights in more exclusive ways, defined more strictly by patrilineal relationships. Some people are being pushed off land that they've occupied for generations because they are only related to the clan through their mothers and not their fathers. Or because they're not related at all, but their families were given land freely when our grandparents did not realise the value of land, as people say now. Or because they're widowed and their husband's family tell them to go back to their father's land. There are also growing tensions in some areas over the incursion of cattle herders and the breakdown of mechanisms for negotiating grazing routes to avoid farm areas. So there's been a really significant shift from historic contexts where people were seen as an asset and land was plentiful, to a situation in which land rights are being defined much more exclusively and land itself is beginning to be seen as a commodity. So I'll come on to some conclusions from this. I think firstly the long history of states recognising customary land tenure, while both misunderstanding and subordinating it, has led to the current situation where communal land rights have unprecedented legal status, and yet many people feel more anxious and insecure about their land rights than perhaps ever before. The particular ways in which governments have interpreted customary land systems as collective landholding under customary authorities has contributed to a hardening of definitions of who belongs and does not belong in this landowning community, and to competition over the authority to allocate land. The recognition of customary land rights should, of course, give people the basis to resist the appropriation of their land by the powerful, and yet it tends instead to lead to localised struggles over land, which increasingly fuel tensions within and between communities. Now, this is very different from feudalism in England, but there are perhaps parallels in how it works to inhibit the recognition and the mobilisation of shared grievances among the poor across the whole country. What I would argue is perhaps needed, but is also much harder to achieve in these contexts of rising competition over land, are not just ways to recognise either individual or community rights, but ways to negotiate the kind of multiple layered rights to access and use land for different purposes that characterised customary land governance in the past in this region, which we can also see perhaps in the Charter of the Forest, in things like English rights of way, and so on. It's actually very difficult, of course, though, to convert those kind of rights into written charters, into laws, into certificates of ownership, which you can now acquire in Uganda, because they were based on flexibility and negotiation, secured through social relations and through the sanction of moral and religious authorities. So these kind of rights depend more on mechanisms for effective mediation than on laws. So on the one hand, written charters and laws may not be able to capture the complexity of customary land rights or be very effective at safeguarding those rights in contexts where the institutions that should enforce them are weak, corrupt and controlled by powerful elites. And we've heard, of course, that the Charter of the Forest was unable to prevent the process of enclosure in England. But on the other hand, and to try to end on a slightly more positive note, it's nevertheless striking how common men and women seize upon these laws and cite them in their struggles over rights. People in South Sudan and northern Uganda now frequently repeat the assertion that land belongs to the people. Political opposition, even rebel groups, galvanise support by promising to defend those rights against the government. And I don't have the time to go into this in any detail, but just an example of a dispute, an ongoing dispute in northern Uganda. It's been going on for 10 years now. The government is trying to lease a large area of land to a sugar company. And the local population have been resisting this, including most famously elder women stripping, bearing their chests against ministers or surveyors or others who come to the area. And this is, I mean, to use Guy's term, the most subversive thing you can do in this culture. For an older woman to do this is like it's so offensive, it's like a curse against the person she does it to. So it's really an emotive and deeply kind of disturbing thing for someone to do. But as well as doing that, people are constantly referring to the Constitution, referring to the specific article in the 1995 Constitution that defends common rights. So it's very much the case, as I know Christian has argued in relation to the Charter of the Forest, that struggles for land rights have become central in the constitution of citizenship and state-society relations in Africa. And that more broadly, charters, laws, constitutions have meanings and effects in those struggles, often far beyond the intentions of their creators. I'll stop there, thank you. Oh, and just to say that there is more detail on this if anyone wants it in a report that was published last year by the Rift Valley Institute, so you can access that, download that from the internet.
Thank you. Plenty of time for discussion and question. I mean, I think one of the interesting things there, that there are obviously, right in the Wales, there are obviously parallels in the kind of stories that we've heard there about the kind of increasing commodification of land, the impact on community and social relations. We've heard much of kind of debates about the question of who owns the land. That's really the sense of what you ended with, Guy, and you and Cherry talked about this as well. But in a sense, I'm also really pleased because we've got two different perspectives, and one of the points of the series was to bring, in a sense, historians together, I say with non-historians, but with people working in different disciplines. And that, I mean, part of what you were saying, Cherry, is that actually there's a kind of danger of that actually common rights are extraordinarily complex, and that they're not necessarily the solution to the problems that we currently face. And in Guy's case, I just wonder whether there's a danger perhaps over-idealising the commons, whether, in the sense that you're talking about reviving the commons very much in the kind of contemporary context. I mean, I wonder whether you could just say, it's not a charge, but it's a question. I mean, do you think that there was a danger of, to use your language, romanticising the commons?
Well, first of all, I thoroughly enjoyed the last talk, so it's nice to follow. I think we're so far removed from that fear that I'm not too worried about it. But of course, you're absolutely right. We cannot over-idealise the commons. The commons, don't forget, are not equivalent to the state of nature or open access. Always had some form of ownership and restrictions, are members of a club. So we think of the village green or a park. There are 27,000 parks in Britain, and they are part of the commons. But that doesn't mean there's no stewardship, no governance structure in those with which we have to nurture. What I'm really concerned about today is that because of the umbrella of austerity, they're cutting budgets, slashing budgets at central level for local councils. So they privatise their urban trees, the care of urban trees. They're part of the commons. And in doing that, things like we're seeing in Sheffield, in London, in Wandsworth, in various places, these privatisers are cutting down big trees because the maintenance of a big tree is more expensive and less profitable than a tiny tree. So they're cutting down beautiful elms and chestnuts just for profiteering. And that sort of thing, we're losing the commons. They're commercialising our parks, turning them in eventism, turning large parts of the parks that are for recreation and calm and the constitutional needs of everybody, whether you're a lover or an old man taking a walk for whatever purpose, instead of which you're turning it into a profit-making things. Well, I'm nothing against concerts and things like that, but we're losing the commons. So I think that yes, we could over-romanticize it, but it's a very useful entry point at this, because we're so far from over-romanticizing. We need to recover our commons. And that, of course, the Charter of the Forest, never fully, but it at least established principles that are dear to our history.
Thank you. Jerry, I mean, is something similar, I mean, obviously austerity is a kind of Western or European kind of dog wolf phenomenon. I mean, what is the role of the state here? I mean, we've talked about the state, in a guy just making the state kind of cutting back services and so on, but what exactly is the role of the state in this picture of communal rights? And the state is a kind of also the kind of bad guy.
Well, I think it depends who's talking. That's always the complexity of it. I think most people in the areas I'm talking about would see the state as the biggest threat to their land rights. Even though these states have championed this idea that land belongs to the people, everyone has seen the evidence of the land being taken from them by, a soldier or by a government minister or by a private company. And it's very difficult to stand up against that kind of state. But there are people who still, I've spoken to women, for example, living in towns who've managed to buy their own piece of land, through the formal process of registering land titles with the government. And for them, they would say, if I was still in the village, I would have had to rely on my husband or my father for land. Now I have my own piece of land with my own land title. There will always be people who see benefits in these processes, even as we can also see the broader negative effects of it.
Questions? Yes?
I think I'm a bit of a pragmatist, and in a sense, we are where we are. We can't roll back to whatever the Charter of the Forest said and live in an ideal world. We have to move forward, and that's a real challenge, whichever government we're trying to persuade. And it may be easier with a Labour, I know we don't want to politicise this, it may be easier with a Labour government than it is with the Tory government. However, putting that to one side, I just wondered whether you feel there's any merit in going down the road, or if there's an opportunity to go down the road that they've done in Scotland with the Land Reform Act, and whether that is a model that we should not seek to replicate, but whether there is some elements of that might be useful for us in England.
I agree with your points, and in my draft that I'm drawing up, and as I said, everybody's welcome to throw in their halfpenny worth, as it were. We have a land registry set up in 1925. If you notice, that's nearly 100 years ago. It still has not managed to register the land ownership in this country. Only about 75–80%. And it turns out that, roughly speaking, the 20% that hasn't been registered belongs to the wealthiest people, because under their rules they only register land when it's sold, and these people don't tend to sell their land. Now, one of the things I'm saying is there should be a complete land registry of all land with from 1 year from passing the legislation. If you haven't registered your land, you either have to pay a heavy levy or it could even be confiscated. So there are pragmatic sort of things. The same with the attempted privatisation of the Forestry Commission. That was truly shocking. Fortunately enough, the commoners stood up and said, hey, no way. But they would like to do it. The same way with fracking. Fracking is an invasion of the commons, whether you take a really romantic or you say the land and the wealth belongs to us, the citizenry. Just before the last general election, the minister responsible, Amber Rudd as it was, she said there is going to be an absolute ban on fracking under national parks. I think probably a number of you will remember that. Immediately after the election, the same minister authorised mining under the national parks. That's the commons. So there are lots of areas where we can defend and say, wait a minute, we refer back to the commons, enough of the principles in order to defend for the people. And you can do it at either local level or national level, and some of these are at national level. It's the same with the water that I mentioned. This is the scandal of the age.
The electricity systems.
I agree.
And Scotland, is there any?
Oh, I beg your pardon. The Scotland. Yeah, I've been up there. I think that Scotland is a huge advance. Huge advance. I personally believe in a land value tax, and I think that we will be moving in that direction. because the worst thing about the Scottish situation is called the Great Clearances.
Oh.
And everybody should know about that. The Duke of Sutherland cleared out 500,000 who were mainly deported. They were crofters and things. And he ended up taking 1.5 million acres of land in Scotland, right? And he was allowed to do that. Today, the Duke of Sutherland has the best art collection in Britain. I wonder if there's any connection. So, you know, this was literally theft of the commons. And he's turned it into, his descendants have the best art collection in Britain. I think that's a scandal too.
So you don't think the Land Reform Act has had any impact on...
Oh yes, it has. It has. And David Cameron's father-in-law described it as an act of Mugabe. He compared that act as equivalent to Mugabe. Well, I think that exposed him to it, because he gets huge tax relief because he runs a deer park for hunting. And they say that it should be business taxed because it's a business. He said, that's scandalous. I should be taxed. No further comment needed.
I think I've managed to almost get a question that ties the two together. And fascinatingly, it's about tax. I wanted to ask, got a guess about the hinge or the relationship between the kind of common rights and common ownership of property, land and other resources, and things such as land value taxation or a basic income, which are about distributivism but within a model of private property ownership, and quite where the boundaries between those two things of common property ownership and merely a redistribution of private property, but individual private property still being a thing, and how you put that kind of mixed economy together. And I think to Cherry, it's a question about how the state copes taxation-wise with the different levels of non-ownership of land, as it were, in the sense of, are they trying to tax, I'm thinking of colonial era attempts of trying to tax land and so on, but how does the state today attempt to try and tax different levels of land ownership here, or is it based on a tax system that is based on sort of duties more than it is on land or wealth extraction within the country?
Sorry, please.
You go first.
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, in the colonial era, I think the basic answer is that land has not been the focus of taxation at all. And in the colonial era, they introduced a poll tax system for a while. But what's very interesting, not just in these countries, but other African countries, is how, after independence, the states gradually gave up on any attempt at that kind of individual taxation. There is income tax, but because most people are not employed in the formal economy, most people don't pay income tax. So really it comes down to tax on commercial products, on trade, on wherever there is an opportunity to tax goods rather than people or land. But of course there are implications there for the state's view of land, because it doesn't provide any benefit to the state as it stands, as customary land. And this is why, President Museveni has said recently, clan lands that people just sit on are useless. They're just leaving people in poverty. They're not helping the country. We need to develop those lands. And this idea of development is such a kind of driving force or agenda for the government. And it basically means trying to develop commercial agriculture, develop mineral extraction, and so on. So I think there are connections in a sense that the state doesn't get enough income from tax, and certainly not on land, to see any benefit from that.
I mean, it's actually in the 13th century, where the state had no tax, its power to tax was really limited. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the Charter of the Forest kind of emerged, because the state, the Crown, just exploited kind of land rights because it couldn't tax its own subjects. And actually, in a way, it's a kind of consequence of the Charter of the Forest that the state is then forced to kind of develop new forms of taxation because it can't exploit its land in the way it did before. So it's, yeah, okay, sorry. Go
Just to add to that story, even Henry III, when the Statute of Merton, he rolled back the respect for it halfway through his reign in 1235. So he was rolling it back and using the tax from the land. So it didn't last long, the respect for the principle. But in responding to your question, which is a very good one, excuse me if I go on a bit, but this is very important for my narrative. The wealth and income of all of us in this room is far more to do with the efforts and achievements of all our ancestors than anything any of us do ourselves. And that wealth has been in the resources that we've inherited, what people have made of the resources, building up our society. And if you allow for private inheritance, then there's a very good argument for saying there should be social inheritance in the payment of a social dividend to everybody, the collective wealth. That's the social justice rationale which I developed in the book for a basic income. Now, a basic income could be paid for by essentially putting taxes on property, taxes on land, taxes on intellectual property, because we also talk about the intellectual commons and the fact that they've been privatized and commercialized in many respects. And they have created rentier incomes. I'm an economist, but the rental incomes from owning assets, which have actually been taken from the commons in a broader sense. So I believe that we should be building up sovereign wealth funds, as they have done in a number of countries, but ours should be democratically controlled by the commoners, if you like, whereby you accumulate taxes on the rental incomes that you can pay out to dividends. So it's a more complicated argument for that. But for me, this is very important for a further reason. We're seeing the development of a precariat. Millions and millions of people, as Christian mentioned at the beginning. And for the precariat, you don't have properties, you don't have a secure income, you have debts, you have a lot of these things crowding in on your time, you're insecure. And the commons for them is worth far more than it is for the rich man. Access to a park, access to public libraries, access to public toilets, access to spaces where you can relax and develop yourself. Those are the commons, the cultural commons too, which we haven't talked about. But they're all part of the structure of society that are not private property. And if you take away our streets, our squares, and you suddenly walk and you find that you can't do X and Y because it's a privately owned road in your own town, this is happening more and more. Huge swathes, as I document, huge swathes of public land that you and I think are public actually are now owned by some big estate that can actually stop us even going into it. So that is a crumbling of the commons. And the tax system is a way, in a sense, of fighting back on that.
Yeah, thank you.
I've got a question for Cherry.
Yeah.
I was really interested in your you speaking about the social value of commons and like the way in which commons bind together communities. I was just wondering, how are people who register their land regarded by communities? Are they seen as some splurs, or that they've disrupted the kind of like order of things in terms of community?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question actually, and I think, partly because where registration is happening, it's mostly in the towns or around the towns, and those urban areas are kind of expanding and encroaching onto formerly commons areas. But the people living in those areas with sometimes quite informal ways of registering land titles, sometimes very localised ways of doing it, they're often quite poor people. They're not necessarily seen as a kind of elite who've gone off and acquired property in that sense. So I think members of the community who register land, there's some understanding of that. People often told me that the ones who sell land are the poorest people, and this is where the privatisation, those who would promote privatisation, I think, are wrong, because actually the poorest people sell their land to pay their hospital fees or their school fees, or because they're desperate for food, and so actually privatisation doesn't protect their rights at all. So there's a sense that if people are selling land, it's very often the poorest people. Where the resentment is focused is where there are kind of elite figures, chiefs and so on, who are selling off lots of land that isn't necessarily their land, it's community land. And I think when that's done on a larger scale or to someone's obvious profit, that's when it creates resentment. But to be honest, registration is really hardly happening, certainly in the rural areas, so in these places where I've been working.
Yeah, right.
Hi, I wanted to ask a question about public attitudes towards particular uses of common land, especially in relation to some of the things you touched on about being used by people who are some of the poorest and most deprived in society. So my question was really, how much do you think that our perception in modern society about what activities like foraging denote, how do you think that impacts on how the rest of society perceives the use of public space? So to give an example, I've got a friend in Cornwall who is a foraging chef, and she produces entire menus of food that she's collected from what she would consider to be, in what many cases for her in a national park are, commons. She's come under an awful lot of criticism by conservation groups, as an example, and by indeed walkers and ramblers and other people out using that landscape for taking things out of the natural environment. So there's a kind of odd conflict there between perhaps what we would consider in the Charter of the Forest sense, that right to herbage almost, coming into conflict with the conservation attitude that I think we have towards a lot of land. And I haven't got a solid idea about what impact that's having, but I'd like to ask if you had any view on that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I think the thing both of us mentioned, Sherry more specifically, is the importance of use value dominating exchange value. The idea of a commons and the ethos in the Charter is that it's essentially preserving nature for reproduction. And there's a nice section on Chiminage, which is really about preserving the right to roam, the right to move around for a person who's got enough for himself or herself to survive. Once it becomes a commercial activity, where you're taking from the commons to make a profit, the exchange value is dominating the use value. Now, it sounds like your friend is probably on the margin.
She's kind of in both. Yeah.
She's on the margin. I would say if she's running a little restaurant and foraging and not threatening the reproductive capacity of the area from which she's taking the herbage, then I would say that's consistent with the common. Once it becomes that you're depleting the capacity of the commons to reproduce itself, then that's when the borderline has changed. So if it's a person of surviving in a market economy, and they're taking the acorns and the whatever it is for meals, I think she's probably all right. It sounds like. In fact, I'd like to go and visit her restaurant. So.
Well, interestingly, she actually cooks outdoors as well. So part of the model.
I think she's well inside. I think she should be allowed to continue.
Yeah, she cooks outdoors.
More questions?
Will you tell us more about how to support your new Commons Charter, or whatever it was you called it?
Yeah.
It's just commercialisation though, isn't it?
No, it's not. Nobody's getting paid. That's what I'm trying to do is I'm working on the economics of the commons, and I'm trying to draw up a charter. What would a charter of the commons, a charter of the forest in the 21st century look like? Imagine that you're posing that. Had a couple of drinks to make it easier, etc. And you actually try and think what would go on. I've thrown out a few of the ideas that I've had. Let me give you one more. Yesterday we were in Sherwood Forest, and tomorrow we're going to be in House of Commons, and then Lincoln on Saturday, and we're throwing these ideas. Yesterday it was mainly about fracking, and a couple of young blokes have taken INEOS to court to try to stop them fracking in the Nottinghamshire area. And they had to mobilise £13,000 themselves to pay for their legal costs, right? Against a multinational which has got government support, so they've got the weight of big money against two little blokes, nice blokes. I haven't met them before. And I proposed, I said, look, wouldn't it be wonderful if the equivalent to legal aid, we saw a government establish a Commons Preservation Defence Fund, independently run, which would have a certain amount of money provided whereby they could allocate a certain amount to support cases that they think are serious legal cases. Okay? They would have to determine, they'd only have a certain amount of money per year, and they'd have to determine how to use it. But you can imagine when you get a big commercial company starting to do this fracking and revolving doors in politics, with some politicians going from being ministers to being on the boards of those companies. It always happens by chance. And you've got the commoners trying to get their rights. Just that's one example of some sort of action. And there are lots of others. So I would say to you, in short, that if you have a specific thing, please write to me, and I promise you that they'll get an audience. Because it's up to us to put pressure.
But can I say, writing stuff down isn't necessarily always the solution. I was thinking, this as a link back to your paper, one of the points you're making is that the codification of things, or the writing down of them, doesn't actually, as opposed that it leads to further conflict, isn't?
Well, it's two-sided. I think on the one hand it can be a weapon for people,
Yeah.
but on the other hand it simplifies and sometimes distorts things that are based on negotiation in real life, and how do you capture that in a single kind of statement? You know, it's a bit like how you negotiate between sheep farmers in the Lake District and people who want to walk there, and, you know, actually finding ways, mechanisms that enable you to agree on the right way to behave that enables both people to use the land is often more useful in the context where I work anyway than a kind of outright law of ownership or, yeah.
Megan?
Yeah, I think I would say historically, at least for a period that I studied, which is 17th century England, the common usage rights are the things that secure perpetuity of commonage. So if you can prove that your usage rights are there and extant and go back, you know, time beyond memory of man, whatever, then that is the way that you prove that the commons are being used and that your right is legitimate. So this isn't a written right; it's something that's in community memory as much as it is, you know, modified by law.
So this actually, this would be something new, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Andy, go on.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be a bit contrary, just so, how to phrase this, but so Christian started to talk about it before, but that in a sense, defending the commons more often than not historically means the people that you're excluding, not the people that you're including. So when you're having a battle about the commons, what you're usually doing is saying that these are there is a moment in the past when commons was perfect. We had exactly the right number of people using the commons, and the threat is actually more people using the commons, or maybe a landlord is using them too commercially or too exploitatively and is kind of overusing them, or whatever it is, but it's kind of, there is this perfect moment in the past, but that is where we need to settle, and then kind of, that's kind of the right thing, and then anything that changes from that is what the problem is. So, in a sense, what you're doing is excluding people. So in the context, sort of modern political context of immigration, of kind of population growth in particular areas and so on. There's kind of a danger and a tension to that thing. And perhaps just to turn it on its head and think about enclosure if you're a landlord, the way that you would justify it to yourself is that in the 17th century at least, I can make my correction, but is that you're improving the land. So what you're doing is you're actually increasing the productivity of the land that is being used, that you own. So it's not being used to its best ability beforehand, and so that's how you justify it yourself. So I'm kind of wondering maybe how people in Sudan and Uganda justify the kinds of commercial use they're making of the land, and if they can do that as well. So maybe there's two vaguely related.
Yeah, very much so. I think, I mentioned President Museveni, and there are many who would agree with him. And of course, this is not just an internal Ugandan or South Sudanese idea. It's driven by the World Bank, by our own government that's providing support, by the whole world of international development behind these ideas. That actually you have people subsistence farming who are living in poverty. If you take that land and do something productive with it, you create your sugar plantation, you'll provide employment, you'll provide all kinds of opportunities. And drive development in a sense that isn't just about benefiting the government, but benefiting ordinary people. The trouble is most people don't have much faith in that because they haven't seen much evidence of any of these enterprises working in that way thus far. But there certainly are those who would argue for it.
Yeah, I mean, your point is obviously valid in the sense that one shouldn't romanticize and idealize everything in the past. But I think that the improvement line was the one line used in the 18th and 19th century. That was the justification for all the enclosures that were taken. It's a very convenient way for the winners to justify robbing from the losers. And that's basically it, because there's not a lot of historical evidence. I'm going to be careful here, but no doubt you historians will be able to contradict, but there's not a lot of historical evidence that enclosing the land in many respects was more productive than a lot of the strip farming that went on. I've just recently been in the Burgundy region, where all the vineyards are split into tiny parcels owned by different people, right? Well, if I'm not mistaken, they have a very high productivity and they're doing very well commercially from the wine that's made from these tiny strips that are owned by multiple families. Because they worked out a governance structure. Doesn't work 100%, of course not. But the terroir is shared and it works remarkably well. I know a lot of areas that have been enclosed were the opposite. But I wouldn't use either argument, really, for it, because essentially we need a commons because the principles, the ethos of use value over exchange value leads you to an ecological direction. It leads you to saying that we need to preserve the resources, we need to preserve and reproduce rather than deplete resources. And that, I think that ethos, and I would prefer to err a bit on romanticizing it rather than err the other way, if you like. But of course there are always dialectical issues that we need to think about.
But we need to choose a moment that we preserve ecology in, because it's always been managed. English ecology. There's no natural environment.
But if I'm not mistaken, we're threatened by global warming. And to say that we've always managed it is an argument for complacency. We are in an urgent phase.
No. But I mean, when we talk about managing the natural environment, so that there's a risk that sheep are overgrazing or whatever it is, they're overgrazing things that were put there that are kind of dominating against other things. It's always been managed.
But it hasn't, you see. It hasn't. That's the tragedy of the Lake District. The tragedy of the Lake District. It's been converted into a huge sheep farm, and the biodiversity has been destroyed. So you've lost the Lake District. It would have to be fundamentally reinvented. It's now being called a World Heritage Site, but they got a commercial farmer to do the evaluation, and he was paid £30,000. He's the biggest sheep farmer, and he was paid £30,000 to do an evaluation of the sustainability of the Lake District. So it's a capture, it's an enclosure. That's why I say it's a corpse. You know, it's a commercially operated rural public space. But I mean, we can lose a lot, and we have done. We have lost. There is only 3% of the total land in England are commons now. 3%. And it used to be well over 50%.
It's just updated comment, and far from me for me to suppress further discussion and debate, just as Andy was getting work. But I suppose I just want to end on William Marshall. There's going to be discussion. There's going to be wine. There's still wine, I hope, and nibbles. And you can speak to Guy and Cherry after the paper. But William Marshall. I just want to end on William Marshall. The radical. I mean, Thomas More, Thomas Paine. What was he thinking, William Marshall? I mean, you know, this isn't, you know, the pamphlet Agrarian Justice. This isn't about the dispossession of citizens. This isn't, you know, late 18th, early 19th century. This isn't Thomas More. You know, he's an aristocrat, and to be honest,
Military man.
so what was he thinking? And so, you know, was he aware of public opinion? Was he, you know, I mean, in a sense, what you're suggesting, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but this is even more radical than we kind of envisaged. And actually, its radicalism lies in its author as much as in its intentions. Yeah, it's a good essay, quite, isn't it? What a hero. That's the historian in me bringing it back to me. Anyway, just want to say finally, just there are questionnaires. Please, if you could, you know, fill those in and leave them on your chair at the end, that would be fantastic. And I hope that you've enjoyed a really interesting, I think, provocative discussion between Cherry and Guy. And if you could just show our appreciation.